think so. Welcome and good evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our lecturer for today. He is TOBIAS Morike, and he is the curator of the Islamic Arts and Crafts collection at the Hamburg Museum in Germany. He is a PhD candidate in Erfurt University. He is about to defend his dissertation, which is entitled Silent Whiteness of the Holy Land, Objects of Knowledge of German Palestine Exploration, 1877 to 1929. Today he is going to lecture on something that is perhaps closer to us, on a Lebanese prince, or someone who pretended to be a prince, a pretender prince, by the name of Saif Hbaish, or Hbaishi, of the notable Hbaishi family, who went around European courts trying to promote himself, probably. I don't know. Mr. Morike will tell us more about Saif Hbaish. Please join me in welcoming TOBIAS Morike. Speak to the microphone, please.
Okay, so I'll use the microphone. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Abu Hussein, thank you for the kind invitation and for the kind introduction of a project which is one of my dearest side projects. So you're all invited to ask questions and to become co-authors in what is hopefully becoming a second book. I would like to start with a few preliminary remarks, because I've emphasized that this talk is about a Maronite. I think everybody here can spot that, where Hbaish comes from. Of course, all the other Lebanese communities had transnational relations. So if we speak about the political implications of my talk, it's more of an intent of grounding a minority history, as we know of Armenian traders, as we know of many people from the Eastern Mediterranean who were in Europe, and grounding them in a European history. So there I've just posted two famous case studies from recent historiography. So Fakhreddin Aman is of course a famous figure here. Hannah Diab from Aleppo in Paris, who was retrieved by Bernard Héberger, who helped to translate and even to invent some of the stories of the Arabian Nights, are, I believe, a few very well-known cases of these travelers. What am I going to talk to you about in the coming, let's say, 40 minutes? I'd walk you through the Prince of Mount Lebanon and what I could find of the so-called Prince of Mount Lebanon in German archives. Actually, he's not the only one, but I would say there are a few more Lebanese with Wanderlust in the 18th century. I'll explain a bit, so that's more or less the descriptive part where I tell you what I found in the archive, and eventually I'll try to come to my research questions, to the hypothesis, putting these things in perspective in the frame of a global microhistory. So actually, Erfurt or Gotha might not be places you could spot on a map. So actually, I came across Baba Hbaishi or Saif Hbaish somewhere in central Germany. So it's the middle of Europe, it's at the same time the middle of nowhere. What is important, there's a very nice Baroque castle where Saif Hbaishi left his robe. So when I started to do my own research on German Palestine exploration, I went to see the keeper of the collection. You have to imagine the most modern device in that office was a coffee machine, And this man told me, oh, we have a robe of that Oriental prince which once came here, which entered the curiosity cabinet. If you want to see it, it's on display. So this robe is linked to a name tag and to a chronicle. So we have the name of Spada Habayshi, who came to Gotha, to this small castle in 1727. This is the printed version of the court chronicle, and I've tried to render this very classical historic German into English. So I don't think it's always flawless. It's even the German original is sometimes a bit odd to me. But at Gotha in February 2077 came here Shadid Saif Habayshi, Principes ex Monte Libano. This gentleman had been unfortunate in a rebellion, and the Turks seized his lands, cut all his beautiful cedar trees to an irreparable damage, and took father and brother as captive. But he was let go that he should ransom the prisoners. He had held a letter of recommendation by the most graceful ruler of the Holy Roman Emperor, Carolo VI, and was received with the Duke with the great douceur. He was kept at table, and a portrait was prepared. According to his belief, he is a Greek and enjoys communion in double nature. Whether this prince is actually the thought of descendant of Hiram and derived from rulers governing this country, we leave to proof, as evidence suggests that his father has some lands in his possessions. So that is basically the story of Spada Habayshi, who uses letters of recommendation going round from Rome to Dresden, Leipzig, many other small courts, and I'm losing the trace in 1728. In 29 there's a Habayshi again who pops up in Paris, so that's why I changed the date. But there are a number of traces in different courts. So what are the sources? We don't have a travel account of himself, but they're letters of recommendation coming from Razir. So they're all kept in Vienna. He leaves in, he sets off from Razir here and goes to Tripoli in 1724, where he receives a first letter of recommendation by the Capuchin monks. Going from there to Rome, there is a Maronite college. He's established there, and from Rome, he sees all the different congregations. So he meets the Jesuits, the Capuchins, and the Jesuits, it's kind of the largest institution at the time. So he even receives a letter of recommendation by the General Master of the Jesuit order. The next step is Vienna, and so the Germany in that part are many small principalities, but in Vienna we find the emperor. The documents are translated there, and the journey takes on to many small courts. So I'll not walk you into detail. The records are sometimes very funny for Weimar. It's like how much beer he drank, how much wine he ordered, how he was dressed. It's the very deep records, and there are also newspaper documents. So there are different newspapers asking him for interviews. So the early printing press takes interest in this Lebanese prince. In 1729, Spada Habayshi joins the Order of Saint-Lazare. So he's even becoming, getting a title, and joins French nobility. There are a few cases where I put question signs, which I'll come back to later, where indications that he might have been there. What do these letters of recommendation look like? One of the most striking ones I found was by the head of the Jesuit order, which I just mentioned, and this is the letter which was actually produced for him in Vienna. So Habayshi claims that his family was captured by the Turks So there is an understanding in Germany at the time that Lebanon is part of the Ottoman Empire, and he's appealing for pan-Christian solidarity. So there are more questions for a Maronite going to Protestant Germany in that time that entangles a lot of border crossing. So, but here is one more document naming him from Vienna as Spada Habaishi, and when he received the gift at the courts, we even have a signature, so where he signs, and even in the Arabic, as Amir Jabal Ibn. So presenting himself as a prince of posture. Eventually how his story ended, if he made it back to Lebanon, is unclear. Richard Pukuk, a British traveller who came to Razia in 1745, I'll not read the quotation fully, but Pukuk recalls that he met a man who traveled through Europe for 8 years, who spoke Italian, and who had been to Europe. So obviously some of these, so Habaishi might have come back, might have returned, but eventually following his trace, I noticed he was not the only one, but there were a number of followers. So we can speak of a European phenomenon. For London, Nabil Mattar claims that an impostor was executed in 1736. I was not able to verify that, but I wasn't able to make sense of the footnotes, but it's some of the things I still need to follow up. There are many small German towns where we find princes of Palestine, princes of Lebanon, which are it's really small and random places where you wouldn't even find a duke or a state institution, but it's the church registered. And sometimes they're like local historians writing emails, but I found a Lebanese prince. They're more mostly people of the Habaish family who travel north, who go to Denmark. We have at least 2 in the 1740s in Copenhagen, and the, let's say, most north one is going to Umeå, so that's northern Sweden in 1745, where Elias Abaski presents himself. There's another case of Abu Genblad Abaisi. So all these names are Italianized or Latinized. So, and it's another possible itinerary which could be reproduced from where he turns up at Exeter, Leeds, then he's in Frisia in the North German islands, and eventually in Copenhagen. And this actually goes beyond Europe. In 1737, a Danish missionary reports from Philadelphia, so that is British North America in that time, that the famous Sheikh Sidi from Lebanon came through Philadelphia, going now through the American colonies. There is a well-known tradition of Sheikh Gazin in Chile in 1745. I've put the reference here. It's a rather well-known element of Gazin who traveled for about 10 years in South America. And the Danish missionaries, again, the Trunkaba mission is in South India, again a Protestant mission, who encounter a Maronite in southern India, or at least they believe so. They write this note during the 7 Years' War, so the British and the French and the Portuguese, they all struggle over the rulership of India, and in these days a man dressed in an unusual fashion visited us. Some laces were bound around his hat, on a cap, to a turban, which was hanging down his shoulders. He wanted to be called Governor of Mount Lebanon, but was born in Jerusalem, he said. The passports he showed were written in Arabic, Syriac, and Portuguese language. In the last one, it was mentioned that his whole family was captured by the Turks and he had to raise 15,000 rupees as ransom. To raise the money, he now traveled around and let himself give alms. He had affinities for the Roman Catholic religion. Since we talked to him about the Christians who live on Mount Lebanon and asked him about the Maronites, hence he said himself to be a Maronite, alms were offered to him by our party, so he left satisfied. So there even seems to be a global dimension. And just to conclude this imposter story, apparently it also worked the other way around. So Carson Niebuhr, who was again a German who was part of the Danish Arabia expeditions, one of the first scientific missions. So there were traders here, but he was part of a scientific mission, and he came to Mount Lebanon. And he speaks of a Lebanese or of a Maronite, probably since he was from Aleppo, of a Greek Catholic who lived in Europe, was probably one of the descendants of one of these princes, came to Lebanon and presented himself as a German duke. There was even a hunting party organized for him. He lived here as a guest and then returned to Vienna. A few weeks later, he was met by one of the Maronites who hosted him and who saw him that he was again moving around in Vienna. So again, this imposter story was also played the other way around. How did this phenomena come to an end? So there was, by the 7 Years' War, a growing knowledge, even in these remote regions of Europe, that there would be no Christian nobility ruling over Lebanon. So starting in France, and I've put the quotation here from the royal verdict, there was an understanding that these beggar princes were not actually part of a nobility. So France, due to the missionaries and also the consulate in Tripoli, is the first country actually to outlaw the presence and the handover of passports and letters of recommendation to these princes. So that then later takes on into different German principalities with different dates, and one of these princes is even persecuted, Bonifacius Altem. He might be Greek, I'm not really sure about this one yet, but in Saxony he was persecuted and even wanted by the police. And by the end of the 18th century, there are more and more travel accounts. So, of course, there is an understanding in the 18th century of the Mediterranean in Italy and France, at the Mediterranean ports, but in northern Germany, there's not such a deep knowledge. So there are travelers like Jonas Kort, who is a librarian who traveled to Lebanon and Palestine, Stefan Schulz and Carson Niebuhr, and they bring knowledge on the political situation of Mount Lebanon to Europe. So that moment actually marks the seizing of the phenomena of the Lebanese princes. So that would be, let's say, the imposter story, starting with Hobaish, who presents himself to a number of European courts. Then he's followed probably by family members of the Hobaish family, and together with European colonization, they even go beyond Europe. Now, how can we put these elements, and I think this very witty story, into perspective? First of all, I would like to ask, why was the narrative of the Lebanese prince even credible in Europe? What was the effect these princes left in Europe? Since, and obviously there was an interest to keep a trace in the royal curiosity cabinet. how can we position among all these other stories of Turkish captives, Greek monks, the Maronite librarians, which we know fairly well, so Hakileni, Asimeni, put their presence into perspective. And for Europe, thinking about the confessional border between Catholics and Protestants, how can we explain that a Catholic Maronite passes into Protestant land? And on the other hand, what was the situation in Lebanon at the time? So Habayshi claimed that his family was captured by the Pasha of Sidon. So what was the background of their travel in the social history of Lebanon, and how can this migration be qualified and grounded from a Lebanese perspective? I would first start with a question how this story actually was credible, and an important element were letters of recommendation, and it's kind of a staircase wit. So in 1724, the Capuchin monks write a letter in French to Spada Habayshi saying, oh, this is a young man and he's a good Catholic. In the Latin translation, this then turns into the prince of the castle of Razia. While in Vienna, this is then he's a prince from Mount Lebanon, and in the German version it turns into the prince of Lebanon. So it's kind of between different languages. This is kind of added. So I think the core of how this works is the letters of recommendation. On the other hand, let's keep in mind it's very small German courts who are very happy to receive a Christian prince from the Middle East. So there is not only one portrait painted, but also a second one in Blankenburg. In Switzerland, Habayshi receives an official tour. The hospital, the library is shown to him. And so that there's also a certain will of receiving a guest. Then what is very important, I think, to any imposter is accomplice. Habayshi had a translator. So, and in one of the documents, we find his signature in Syriac, in Arabic, and, there is a mixture of German and French of Lazare, interprète, who acted as translator, so who spoke Italian, probably somebody who was attached to the Maronite college in Rome, and who traveled with Spada Habayshi. So I think that thinking about the credibility, it's also as a duke presenting himself with a translator. Thinking about the Lebanese perspective, we know that in 1709 the Habaysh provided safe haven for Haydar Shihab, and that there were conflicts with the Pasha of Sidon, and I'm very much looking forward to your comment on this. But I'm wondering, since this is time-wise kind of removed, if there are other quarrels documented, and if this narrative of saying, well, our trees, and probably it were mulberry trees, were cut down, can that be verified? Another question would be, since the Habaysh family obviously made a small fortune in Europe, if the money was reinvested in any sense, so if we can link that to a social history to the area. So, and we have at least one expert for the view from Istanbul among us. Would be my ground and my central hypothesis. So I would like to put these Lebanese princes into a history of knowledge, claiming that they served as knowledge brokers, providing knowledge prior to the age of exploration. So before Europeans were actually traveling to the Middle East, that they made an indirect but crucial contribution to Oriental studies, and that their voyages even marked a transition from the Catholic centers like Rome, Madrid, Paris, where the Maronite librarians were present, to the more remote places of Protestant Europe. In the first place, I'd like to say they were object interpreters. Wherever they visited a court, the libraries, the coin collections, they were presented the Turkish booties, and they were asked to decipher objects and to explain what things were. And especially the notion of coins was crucial to build a historiography. So in the same fashion of learning from the antiquity and collecting Roman coins, these early Enlightenment courts also started to collect Arabic coins and wanted to know about different dynasties. So just a few examples. So for example, let's go back to Gotha. There was the interest of providing and building a document. So there is a portrait painted, which is today lost. There is a speculation on the communion and even tracing Habayshi back to Hiram, so a phenomenon which I would call biblical Orientalism. So the presence of a Lebanese is read through the eyes of the Bible and through the lens of the Bible in the first case. And still there is an interest to create a specimen, so to keep his robe and his shoes for the curiosity cabinet. Other courts react very differently to his presence. They actually want to know, are there Christians in Lebanon? So this is an example from Wolfenbüttel, and I'm not sure if you can see it in the back, but this is another small court in Germany, and what they do is they go to the library. And it's a 7 pages dossier on the situation in Mount Lebanon. And here they cite Jérôme Dandini and Simon de la Roque, and they actually start to do a literature review on the situation in Lebanon. Habayshi himself reorganizes a library. So this is a monastery library where there is a note that Habayshi, who has been personally interviewed in Schweinfurt at the Chancellery, explained that this specific book should not be a prayer but a titular booklet. And there are a number of scholars who complain that the Maronite princes whom they meet do not master Arabic as well as they do, so they're very German and they think they know better. So there is Gottlieb von Moor, who's one of the principal early modern Orientalists, and he says, well, it is surprising that Antoun Habaysh, Prince of Sevan, read the coin like a Hofrat completely wrong, but they're constantly engaged when it's possible to meet a Lebanese prince as a knowledge broker. The same happens to Johann David Michaelis, who is, let's say, the founder of German Oriental Studies. He met a Maronite and they exchanged some Arabic verses. A few years ago, I went to test an Arab of noble birth but no scholar. After he had written to me some new Arabic verses that he liked as a sample of poetry, I gave him some poems printed in my chrestomathy. It is true, he said, that at the first sight these would be heavy, for not only the unstudied but also some scholars. Alone, after I had just well helped him with these old poems, as he helped me with the new, he understood them so vividly that he found them beautiful. The idea here, Michaelis even wants to show off his Arabic in comparison to an unlearned nobleman. And there was the idea of using the Lebanese princes as translators. So this is an episode from Dresden. In Dresden, porcelain was reinvented. So there's a big fascination to the Ottoman Empire, but also in Europe with porcelain from China, which was imported till 1710. August the Strong had experiments made, and then Meissen was able to reproduce porcelain. And here the idea was to ask for translation into Ottoman, which a poor Lebanese prince was not able to deliver. So, again, it's a small episode, but I think they really show an incitement of curiosity and that they act as knowledge brokers. Eventually, there is, after the 1750s, when the phenomenon comes to an end, an afterlife in German literature. So many of you might know the Lettres à Carson de Montesquieu, where a few strangers travel through Europe, look back, and bring a critical perspective on the Baroque courts. The Lebanese travelers had a similar function. They were kind of the honest princes. And there is a German version of the Robinson. So the to water and land traveling Robinson of Mount Lebanon, which was originally published in 1755 in Frankfurt, then was translated into Dutch. There's a famous Danish religious scholar who used a Lebanese prince as a figure to criticize other Protestant group. And by the 1780s, another German poet had a cedar prince, it's kind of the poor, honest nobleman who's good-hearted. And by the 1790s, the whole story of the Lebanese prince was again codified in a poem, which reads Der Prinz vom Libanon. So there is an afterlife in literature to this phenomenon. So I'd like to conclude that Maronite travelers, again, this hypothesis, this indirect but crucial contribution. So inciting interest in the Middle East, asking questions, translating objects, and shifting from the large libraries of Rome, Paris, Madrid, where we know a number of Maronite librarians, to the Protestant periphery. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias. That was very interesting as well as entertaining indeed, and typical Lebanese, I would say. And the floor is now open for questions or comments if you have for Mr. Morike. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Maronites, but what about the rest of the Arab region? Did the Germans also entertain other imposters from different parts of the Middle East?
There were Greek monks in particular going around. So together with the princes of Lebanon or the princes of Palestine, there are Greek monks who ask for raising funds for the reconstruction of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This is one group of imposters. And there, of course, the Jewish communities which were driven out from Spain, which are mostly in port towns, some of them convert to Christianity, and generally, and for putting it in a larger perspective, all minority groups in a way, people who were poor had to be mobile because they were not allowed to be residents in cities. So even if people were, for example, formerly enslaved as so-called renegades, in Tunisia and Northern Africa who returned, they had to wander around. So there are, I think, many more of Mediterranean stories. Let me add two more groups, the Armenian Traders, which we know more in the port cities in Marseille, but also in the Netherlands, and the captive Turks. So they were, after the siege of Vienna,
So,
yeah.
so this pyramid scheme, in a way, or the fundraising tactic, was against the backdrop of a narrative that had persecution of minorities in a way.
Yeah.
Wherever there were persecuted minorities, you would have these imposters asking for fundraising, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in one of the previous slides you mentioned that Lebanese princes served as knowledge brokers and made indirect and crucial contributions to Oriental studies. This is happening in the 18th century, right?
Yeah.
What about the period when there was a knowledge broker sitting in Andalus translating Arabic scripts and then transmitting it to Europe? It was done much earlier than the 18th century. So, and it would seem that this should be the first kind of flow of knowledge at that time. So how big the contribution of this later period imposters to the knowledge in Europe about the Middle East?
And there was, of course, always contact, so it would put things into wider perspective. But I would say there's a great difference between the knowledge in the centers. So if we think about Madrid, if we think about Paris, where there is an Arabic manuscript collection since the 16th century, and Rome, where there is a direct contact through the Maronite College, and these rather remote places of small Protestant areas, which are more detached and behind the Alpine mountains and not so much in touch with the Mediterranean.
So as a result, they fall for these imposters because they don't have the direct knowledge as in the center.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think obviously that lack of knowledge, and which I think this case from Wolfenbüttel shows very well, that actually return to French travel accounts and to Italian travel accounts, trying to find out more and to get a deeper insight.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. I'd like to comment on the fluidity, what you were wondering about the fluidity between Catholic and Protestant.
Yeah.
This has been recently studied by Bevilacqua in a book called the Republic of Arab Traders.
Yeah.
So the Protestants and Catholics were arguing and had feuds, but they were talking to one another. There was a lot of fluidity and contacts. And I think these Maronite, whatever you call imposters or whatever, actually were like brokers of, or they would put their weight one side or another by giving material to fuel the discussions or to champion the side, one side against the other. The case of Ekelensis, you mentioned Egerge, has studied the case of Ekelensis and others. And I'd like also to remind of another Kassiri, Michael Kassiri, who was a Maronite priest and who catalogued all the manuscripts of the Escurial.
Yeah.
So that's another. So the Ghaziris or Kassiris, the problem is that they go on the Latin names. We don't realize that they're Ghaziris. Thank you.
Thanks for recalling also part of the state of the art, which I kind of skipped. But I think the difference between Bevilacqua is that he is rather looking at people at the centers of scholarship, like Jan van Eyck, who was in touch with the Vatican. But here I think the difference is that it's really on remote places where there is no,
Yes, but it's the contact that is important. And also he's trying to show, actually, his thesis is to show that the Enlightenment did not happen because of secularism. The Enlightenment happened because also the churches, the religious sides were debating and using all this material.
Yeah, obviously. Thank you. I've kind of let out the question of the librarians because we only have one or two of Arabic teachers which are in the wave of Asemanios and the whole Asemani family who actually come to Germany. So they're, I think, much more prominent in Madrid, in Rome, and it's, much less. It's one or two scholars we actually know of. Yeah.
But maybe you should link this whole thing to the Maronite College, because these people, these secular people, maybe got the idea that there was something going on in Europe and they could make some profit out of it.
Yeah. And the Maronite College is obviously the hub from where people take off, and we know of Melkite monks who go to northern Italy and then Switzerland and from there beyond. And the entry point is the Maronite College.
I want to ask you a little question. I know among the individuals you listed, there were at least 3 or 4 Abu Ginblat.
Yeah.
Is this Ginblat by any means? Is one?
I don't know. Could be. I mean, I was also wondering. I'm just
In this case, the Druses also partook of this sort of knowledge brokering.
Yeah. I don't know. I was also wondering that, but sometimes the names are. Through the Latinization is yeah.
The case you mentioned of the execution of the impostor happened in England, right?
Yeah.
Which means that the English actually verified that this guy was an impostor through their network, and they had a better understanding of Mount Lebanon than the Germans, who were in a way duped into believing that Ahbesh could actually be a prince, because anyone who is right familiar with Mount Lebanon would laugh at this. That Ahbesh, this is why in the case of Mount Lebanon they used a famous name, which is Jumlat, which might actually resonate, knowing that the Jumlats were divided according to the French and the British. They were not.
That's much later, I believe.
Yeah.
Anyway, the other question is about the princes of Palestine.
Yeah.
I mean, we of course know that tradition of princedom in Lebanon is very much alive up to the present. To my knowledge, I don't know of anyone who was called or called himself prince in Palestine. So that's to me it's very striking. So I would like to. And if you have examples of this, I'd like sometime to see them.
The titles are mixed, so it's Prince of Palestine, Prince of Phoenicia, and it's also other groups who take up that name. So, for example, Jonas Korte, he encounters somebody who claims to be a Lebanese prince, and then while he asks him for his Arabic, it turns out that he's a Bulgarian. So. Well, it kind of seems to be a more general fundraising project at the time.
The final comment is about the story that we made up with Saif Habashi about the Ottomans killing his family and uprooting the cedar trees. Of course, and in 1709, 1711, there was the famous Battle of Ain Dara, which happened some distance away, even from Ghazir. And it was mainly a Druze affair, Shihabs and Druzes, with some Maronite participation, which was minimal, in fact. So obviously he put his own personal plight, as he made it up, in the context of this. And there was the Pasha of Sidon, of course, and the Pasha of Damascus were fighting in that battle. So probably that's the reference.
Yeah. And that's what I believe, that it's actually a fact, but which is, a bit distorted and transferred.
Yeah, a lot distorted. Any further questions? Yes, sir.
I was actually last week introduced to this person from the 18th century, also called Elias Habeshi, spelled with an H or without an H. He apparently traveled throughout Europe. A lot of sources say he worked for Russia after having worked for the like the Ottoman.
Yeah.
And there are conflicting sources about his. Some say he was from a Phoenician Greek family from Constantinople. Some say he was like a Dunmid Jew. Some say he was like a Jew from Aleppo. And his like I just like learned about this office like a few days ago, like maybe yesterday. And yeah, this similarity is very, very striking. Obviously, the Habeshi here is a pseudonym. It's not his actual name, but it's like he's from the same century, and he engaged in the same roughly the same endeavors. He traveled in Europe. Do you think there's a reason to this?
I think the pseudonym. Do you want it directly? No. So this Elias Habaski is the author of a book called The Present State of the Ottoman Empire, which is published in 1750s. And actually in the beginning of the book he already states, but this is not my actual name, but I'm Alexander Griga, I'm Greek. So I think this is a pseudonym by a British person who participated in the Crimean Wars. And this is a compilation plagiate of different texts on the Ottoman Empire which were circulating in the UK. It was a very successful book, found a translation into French, into German, circulated widely, and already the reviewers at the time said, well, this is quite dubious. There is this small, just to advertise my own work, I wrote a small contribution to the encyclopedia on Christian Muslim relations, and I hope to show that it's actually a compilation plagiate in a time where peer review, citation, comment, where academic print is not, or writing is not yet established, and that is possible.
Again, this is very interesting. Thinking about all these connections. I mean, it first came up with the titles. I'm wondering if maybe there's a kind of, if the guy was kind of playing on the idea of Crusader princes, and people kept bearing European titles that would come from this part of the world and then perhaps go back to Europe. So that might be kind of one way to pull the wool over people's eyes. But also, I wonder if maybe there seems to be a kind of Abyssinian connection too. And I wonder if maybe there's a kind of layer of Prester John in this whole tale. I think there is oftentimes Prester John is associated with Central Asia, but also with Abyssinia, as I recall.
Yeah.
So, do any of these types of connections come up? I guess you would have probably mentioned them, but there seems to be kind of a whole array of weird connections that perhaps might capture the European imagination.
Yes. I mean, obviously there is, let me take the question from two sides. One is the Ethiopian connection, where there's a very specific connection to Gotha, and I would say there is a more general Protestant story, so which takes interest in Christian communities in the Middle East. So let me start with the more general story. These Protestants are interested in, is their Bible translated correctly? So they're interested in Hebrew, but also in pre-Catholic traditions. So Jan Lopez is one of people who work on this. So the interest is understanding the traditions of Middle Eastern Christians, of Orthodox, better to activate them as a source, also to argument against the Catholic Church. So therefore this interest, and also this question on how he actually celebrates the communion and what is this, Habaishi's tradition on the Last Supper. Gotha has a very specific relation because a Jesuit Ethiopian came to Gotha so to this very small remote town by the end of the 17th century, working on the first Abyssinian dictionary. So Abba Gregorius, I think by the 1690s, turned up in Gotha, and there is this Ethiopian connection as well.
Any more? Thank you very much.
What's the name of this Jesuit from Gotha?
Abba Gregorius. Abba Gregorius. Gregorius. So he.
Thank you, Tobias, very, very, very much. Thank you all for coming. Goodbye.